And hello, everybody, and welcome to this podcast. I am Doug, and I am really glad to be here today to start a series, as we have noted in the newsletter, on glorious freedom. Yeah, I was thinking about freedom, 4th of July here in the United States, and different shows, History Channel and others that are tracing this quest for freedom that, well, humans crave universally. Freedom is something, I don't care what country you're in right now listening to this podcast, you know that freedom is something that we all crave. This country was founded on it. Our board, for example, is from literally 4 different continents, 5 countries. So we're very familiar with the universality of it. But, to seek freedom is to struggle against that which is controlling you or binding you in some way. But make no doubt about it, freedom is our nature. Bondage is not our nature. But here's the thing, freedom always involves disruption. It always involves disruption. Your life and your seeking freedom has been disrupted. So's mine. And that's what I want to do in this series. I want to talk about the ways in which that's happened, why it's happened, and also to share with you my experiences as being the same as your experiences, and your experiences as being the same as the experiences of those who live in other countries, other places, and have other life conditions, but still crave the same thing. So, what I'm going to start with in this first episode is the disruption of the structure of Christian identity. What it means to move into God identity. That is been, it is right now, an extremely disruptive process. And I want to start first with just the structure or the form of religion. We'll move specifically to the form of Christianity, but I want to start with the form of religion. And I always go to the narrative. The narrative to me is my guide. I see in the narrative universal principles of God, Spirit, and my nature, my created nature in that story, and it's the story of me. I see myself reflected from the genesis of the story all the way to the finishing and fulfillment of the story. I see myself reflected in the lives of others that are in that narrative because the narrative is the story of our universal journey. So, when I was thinking about this, and as I think I put in the newsletter, Romans 8, verse 21 came to mind immediately. Paul was saying there, 2,000 years ago, the creation itself will also be delivered from the bondage of decay into the glorious freedom of the children of God. There is where I took the title for this series, Glorious Freedom. Freedom is glorious. And it is a process. It is a process that Paul said began with the universal, the whole creation, the planet, and all the people therein seeking to be delivered. You don't go to bed one night in bondage, wake up the next bondage free. It's a process, and we're going through it now. So we want to look at, what did that mean when Paul and the other apostles were going through this process, and what were their life conditions? What do they have to tell me about what to expect? And what about all the things and the emotions and the feelings that I'm experiencing right now? Is this normal? Am I going the right direction? And of course, in the biblical narrative, there's some writings that are really talking to the people at that time and saying, you hang in there. Don't turn back. Don't turn back. And we're going to look at all those kinds of elements as well. But when Paul wrote all those years ago, they also were in the middle of a tremendous attempt to break free. So when we talk about that setting, we're talking about people that have the same life conditions that we have 2,000 years ago from a freedom standpoint. And I want to talk to you about your personal struggle as a seeker of God identity. I want to share with you the conversations that I've been having literally for decades. And so while we can say and acknowledge, everyone on the planet right now is involved in this struggle, meaning that we have listeners that come from all parts of the planet, and there are struggles for this type of freedom going on all over the planet. The question then becomes, hey, how are you responding to it? Right now in your life where you are, as you listen to this, how are you responding to it? So if I look at Romans 8 and I see this struggle is worldwide, I see it's universal, immediately, there's a comfort in that. There's a comfort to know that there's not something strange about me. Why me? Why am I feeling this way? It's always good to know that I'm part of something that all humans experience, the whole creation. And specifically for those listening to this podcast, Paul's talking about the same subject. He's talking about God identity, because the end result of this freedom is that they're delivered as children of God. Children are defined in terms of identity by their source, who are your parents. And so the source of identity is God. God identity. We'll talk obviously a lot more about this, as we go along, because that seems pretty plain and ordinary, but as well as I do, for those that have been doing this for a while, that when you get into discussions with those that have attached to Christology as an identity, they're calling themselves not children of God, but they're calling themselves Christians. And there's a huge difference there. But this children of God is an identity thing that is going to help me define what my nature is. Well, God, or spirit, is the ultimate nature of freedom. And you and I are created in the image of that nature. We are created to be free. That is our natural space. And when disruption comes, and chaos comes, and doubt comes, and anxiety and fear comes, then we should understand this is because there is a struggle to break free from something that's not in our best interests, right? And the narrative is pretty clear. Well, God cannot be held in bondage by any human being. We will talk, however, as we go along here, about the desire to break free from authoritarian structures that attempt to set themselves up as the ones who are going to decide whether you're of God, not of God, have good, healthy God identity, or whether your God identity is going astray, or whether you've lost your God identity. Those authoritarian structures are part of what I want to talk about in this first episode because, again, the role of structure. So let's go all the way back. Let's go all the way back many centuries before Christ and the apostles appear on the scene. And what is the first structure that we encounter with a human collective? Well, first of all, the human collective that's chosen to be the model for us is the collective of Israel. Israel was chosen to be a model for us. Okay. So what was the structure that was the primary identity symbol for that collective of people? Well, it was the temple. David wanted a temple built to honor God. It was his son Solomon who saw the project through, and under Solomon, the temple was built. But even as far back as King Solomon, there was a recognition by him, and he says it, it's right plainly in the text. Nevertheless, Solomon says, as spectacular as this building is, God does not dwell in buildings made with hands. Made with hands is always going to come back to the human self as source. For those of you who have followed these podcasts for years, you know that we've talked at great length about self as source. But you know what? There are a whole lot of new people that are following presence now, and so we have to go back and layer back over these things, and we need to go back over these things and remind ourselves even where the problems come from that we're struggling with. A lot of times you forget why it was that you made different moves in life. And this made with hands is pointing to the fact that structures and human involvement in those structures can oftentimes become very dysfunctional and misconstrue and actually take us off the mark. And this idea of God does not dwell in a building made with hands was a big deal. So big, in fact, that when you get over to Acts 7, you have Stephen. And what is it that Stephen says to them? Nevertheless, God does not dwell in buildings made with hands. What was the result? The man was stoned to death. And I can't think of a much worse way for someone to lose their life than through that kind of a process. Well, as I go along here, I want to talk, and will, primarily as we move into later episodes here, about the price of freedom, the cost of freedom, because freedom is costing you. There's a price you're paying right now for freedom. Jesus himself said, hey, look, if you're going to go out and try to accomplish anything, you need to first sit down and count the cost, because it is going to cost. But even the cross event was one where the story tells me that Jesus endured the price of the cross, the cost of the cross, for the joy set before him. So that's encouraging to me, because I know that if I'm going through some things now, there's disruption, distress, etc. This is meaning I'm right on track. This is the way freedom happens. And it's worth every bit of it. So you got Stephen in Acts chapter 7 saying this. And what's really amazing to me is that it says this Saul of Tarsus was standing there giving consent to the death of Stephen. Saul of Tarsus was standing there. Stephen was stoned to death for this. Paul is in agreement with this. Why? Because the building, the temple, was God identity. To speak against the temple, the building, was to speak against God identity itself. Now, Paul had an experience, a Damascus Road experience. It transformed him and his perspective completely. His understanding of God identity completely transformed. So here in Acts 7, he's standing there while this is going on, and Stephen is stoned for saying what he said against the building. You get out to Acts chapter 17, Paul's in Athens at this time, and he goes to speak to them at the Areopagus. And what does he say? He says God does not dwell in buildings. He says the very same thing that previously he was taking the life of Stephen for. That is transformation. And what happened when Paul was there in Athens? The narrative says that when he looked around and he saw all the idols, all the things to which people were attached for their sacred identity, it says that he was distressed by what he saw. Are you distressed by anything you're seeing today? I'm going to say that all of us look around and see the state of things in whatever country we're in, and there are things about which we are most distressed. I'm holding this conversation specifically to the distress that's associated as one evolves in their understanding of universal God identity and moves beyond the previous boundaries of God identity that you feel like were holding you in bondage. And again, it's because this is the nature of nature. It's the process that is universal to all of us. So if you're finding things to be distressing, welcome to the chaos of transformation. Transformation is disruptive. It brings about chaos, but that's not the end of the process. It just means you're in process. Now, when I moved to the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews went into considerable detail about the temple, what was in the temple, what was in the Holy of Holies, how the high priest and the priesthood worked. And this was why? Why did someone feel the need to write all about this building again? Here we got the building. Once again, it's the building. What's the big deal with the building? Well, the writer is trying to explain everything that you experienced in the past about your God identity or Christ identity has been tied to a building. So if you're someone out there that's left the building, that's what we're getting to, right? The first thing we're going to note is disruption and distress is associated by the simple act of deciding I'm not going back to the building. And we have to recognize that that's no small thing. You got apostles that are writing about this, Jesus that's teaching about this. It's no small thing. So we have to acknowledge, yeah, this is what we're going through. This is what's happening to us. So the writer emphasizes as well at the end of this Hebrews essay, writing of encouragement, the writer makes this statement: we have here no continuing city. The city and the temple were going to go away. And the audience to whom he wrote was really, really struggling with that idea, that thought. This is the way we experience God. How in the world does it go away? And the big question becomes, how else can God be experienced? When you're in a process of transformation, the first thing that happens is deconstruction. But when you're deconstructing, you have not yet moved into the what next phase. Spiral dynamics tells us that the movement of evolution is from what to what. And when we start, all we know is from what. That's all we talk about, from what. I don't go here because. I'm no longer in this because. I have seen myself restricted and feeling the boundaries too tight, a bondage type feeling. And all the conversation that you have initially is from what? From what? I no longer this, I no longer that. But as you sit and reflect and the process continues, well, the next thing you're thinking is, well, what is going to be the to what? I don't see any manifestation of to what. There's nothing on every corner for me to go to that's speaking out about this message of freedom from the authoritarian structures which attempt to dictate and control who has God identity and who has not. There are other people I'm finding, and Presence is trying to be such a connector, who are having the same deconstructive process going on, but there's no too what yet. I've had calls over the years, and one of the first things people want to know is there anyone in my city, in my country, in my area that's also holding and talking about these concepts? That's telling us that where we are today is exactly where the people were 2,000 years ago, and the person who wrote Hebrews did it because he was concerned that they were going to get discouraged and give up hope, or perhaps even go back to that old attached identity. And the writer is giving them encouragement. Hey, hang in there. You know, in the first letter that Peter wrote, it was in 2 Peter, I'm sorry. He is talking about Jesus coming again, and he said, I understand you all are asking, where's the promise of his coming? Because everything continues right now at this time in our history, Peter says, everything is continuing just as it has all the way back to the fathers, all the way back to when the temple was first built. Everything looks the same. People still go there for the Day of Atonement, still celebrate the feast days. The high priest is there, the priesthood's there, the sacrificial. It's 30-something years after Jesus ascended, and Peter's saying, I get it. For the last 30 years, it looks to you like nothing has changed. Nada. But hang on, because Spirit moves in the realm of the unseen. Spirit moves in the realm of the unseen, and it is Spirit that is the power of change. It ain't me. I don't change anything. I attempt to let Spirit move through me so I can help contribute to the transformation and change of others. But I myself, I can't get distressed about what I think I can do or what I should be changing or how much things should be changed, because when I do that, I've just taken the ball away from Spirit. I've said, let me take this thing. It doesn't look like you're getting anywhere. So not only do you have these writers and apostles talking about this, when you get out to the end of the narrative, what do you have? You got John talking about a new creation. Now remember, we started with Romans 8. A whole creation's trying to get delivered. That whole creation, trying to get delivered into glorious freedom. John sees the new creation. New creation has come. Well, how do we describe that? John says, with regard to the new heaven and earth, and I saw no temple there. I saw no temple there. Nor did John say that he saw a church building either. And we're obviously headed that direction, right? You know where this is going, this conversation. But the point, again, is to start with, there were real people living at that time, and they were going from a place where their God identity was attached to temple to a place where there was no temple. That is pretty significant transformation. Now, where did the apostles get this idea about temple, and where did they get these ideas about it going away and the building, and why was Stephen willing to die for such a concept? Why were these people willing to go through the disruption, the persecution? And we're going to talk about what type of suffering that you are going through right now that must come with the struggle for freedom. We're going to talk about that in future episodes. But where did they get this? Where did the apostles come up with these ideas? They came up with these ideas through the uniquely called Son of God, firstborn one, Jesus of Nazareth. Let's remember that Jesus was the foundation of everything transformative, and specifically when we talk structure, Jesus began every single one of his eschatological teachings, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, he began each time at the temple. And while his apostles were pointing and saying, "Hey, isn't this magnificent?" Probably trying to impress Jesus. "Isn't this temple magnificent?" Jesus, hits him between the eyes. "I'm telling you the truth, not one stone will be left on another." Bam. What? Inconceivable. What is he talking about? Why, this temple has been around since the days of Solomon for centuries upon centuries, and you're saying what? They could not imagine how that would be possible. Well, maybe just like it's difficult for me to imagine how life conditions today could possibly change and how someday there could be people in every city having the conversation that we're having. Imagine that. If I go back to that event and the destruction of the temple and what Jesus said to those who were listening and following and realizing that there was something going on that was really bringing about a change of creation, a change of identity, and I think about that, I think of those that fled to the mountains, as Jesus encouraged. Flee to the mountains when you see these things begin to happen, he said. Get out. It's going down. Those people left everything they had. They left everything they had ever known and experienced about God. With the temple, they lost the Day of Atonement, which was the centerpiece of their forgiveness from God. They lost the Day of Atonement. They lost the high priest, the entire priesthood itself. They even lost their genealogy. See, from that event forward, there is no knowledge about who belongs to what tribe anymore. Jesus was from Judah. Paul said he was from the tribe of Benjamin. John the Baptist was a Levite. On and on we could go. Genealogy was part of their identity, just like temple, sacrifice, priesthood. All of that is what made them God's children. All of that made them God's children. They were already God's children. Why did anything need to change? Because there was a higher level of understanding God identity that needed to come along. A higher level. And when you're in the middle of that, I can only imagine 2,000 years ago, the confusion had to be out the roof. What has happened? Why did it happen? And where in the world are things going to go? Where in the world are we going to end up? And how will anything be different, better than what we've had? This is nothing but a tremendous loss. That's all they were thinking. Freedom. This is about loss. I've lost so much. We'll talk about that in the future too, because that's a truth. When you leave to move to something else, you're leaving things that restrict, constrain, control, you feeling in bondage in certain ways, but make no doubt about it, there are other things that are a loss. We're going to acknowledge that because we all need to know as we think about this message, this isn't just a chess game. We're not just doing paradigms here and models and spiral dynamics and Venn diagrams to play a chess match with somebody and prove that all these things happened in the first century and the temple was the center of the coming of Christ and we now need to combat all the premillennials and no. This is about my life, who I am. That's why it's important to me. This is about who I am every day of the week, not just when I'm, in a building. What does a building have to do with the coming of a whole new world? What does a building symbolize? Well, do you remember when you left the building? Those of you who have, not everybody has, and that's fine because we've emphasized that evolutionary growth is something that each person must experience on their own, at their own pace, and in their own way. And because we all have universal God identity, there is no anxiety in that. But for those of you who did leave the building, do you remember the emotion and feelings tied to that decision? Well, as I said, I want to start moving in the next episode into what we are dealing with in our feelings, our emotions that control our thoughts and from which our thoughts come, and what we're going through, and what makes it especially difficult at the beginning of a process when there are only a handful that begin every new process. That's why the biblical narrative uses the term first fruits. That is a term that indicates only some, only a handful at the beginning. It's not the end of the process, but it is indicating a process has started. So we're in it. We're in the process. So I'm going to start that in episode 2. We're going to talk about the background of all these things, and we're going to talk about why it is so critical for us to be messengers of glorious freedom. So, thanks for joining me for the series. I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.